Hello and welcome into another edition of the reimagining of the Metroid Dread soundtrack. It's been a really fun and creative journey recreating the tracks from this game, and we're slowly approaching the last couple of main areas. And in this video we're tackling Elun and looking at how I approached this small but crucial part of Samus's trek to the surface of ZDR. Let's talk a little bit about the area from a story standpoint. Samus's trip to Elun contains an important step in the journey through Metroid Dread. We discover that in this small, confined structure, Ravenbeak and the Mawkin have contained an epidemic of X-parasites under the surface of ZDR. As Samus fights her way through the infected creatures of the quarantined structure, we learn that the dangerous parasitic life form has become a threat to all life on ZDR upon its release into the rest of the planet. Elun is a crucial part in uncovering the task at hand that Samus is truly dealing with. I see it as a turning point in the game, where things begin to shift into a more threatening and hostile environment. Even in other areas of the game that have already been explored, the presence of the X-parasite paints a dark cloud over much of the planet, changing your interaction with ZDR and its inhabitants until the end of the game. Because of this, I believe the accompanying soundtrack needs to be rooted in suspense, like there's something lurking in the shadows at all times. And at the same time, Elun contains many of the elements of the previous areas with it, most notably Ferenia, which both itself and Elun seem to be designed and populated by the Mawkin tribe. To talk about the original track is a little complicated for me because I have some very mixed feelings. There are kind of two sides of the coin about my thoughts on it. One side is the music itself, and the other side is its fit into the area and soundtrack as a whole. To explain what I mean by that, let's zoom out for a minute and talk about the whole of Metroid Dread soundtrack to this point in the series. It's been a while since we've taken a step back from the specific areas, and I think now is a good time to start thinking about the culmination of how these reimagined tracks have changed the whole experience of Metroid Dread. I've said a few times throughout this series that by diving deeper into the original soundtrack, I've gained a different appreciation and respect for what the composers Soshi, Abe, and Sayako created for this game. While there are many things about the approach that don't resonate with me, I have started to understand a little better what they sought to do through the style of composing that was utilized. The idea behind the game's entire experience to me is heavily rooted in the feeling of being hunted. The ME sequences are really the thread tying ZDR together, and I haven't gotten into those musical elements yet, but the sensation of dread really is the goal of this journey. And when you look at the original soundtrack from that perspective, I can kind of make more sense of it. Take Gavrin, for example. I spent some time in the last video laying pretty hard into that track, and for all the musical reasons I did state, I do feel that it's a hard listen and something I don't particularly enjoy the sound of. However, in the context of the whole experience of Metroid Dread, as I've been listening to it more and more, there is something weirdly effective about it when it's all said and done. One thing I will say as a compliment to the original OST is that it is very cohesive in the sense that the composers really created a unique and consistent sounding world through the music. The longer you play, you start to learn the musical language that the game is slowly teaching you. It's a language that isn't based on melodies, memorable moments, or large dynamic ranges. Instead, it's a language based on, well, the best way I can sum it up is tension. It's all throughout the game's soundtrack, but it's presented in a much different way than typical, especially for a Metroid game. But that sense of cohesion and a consistent language is, in my opinion, perhaps one of the most important elements of any soundtrack, movie score, and even albums when it comes down to it. Even if I don't particularly understand or enjoy the language of Metroid Dread, there is still an intended feeling that permeates the entire game. So when it comes to this Elun track, I don't want to spend as much time talking about the specific musical elements in this video. One reason is because a lot of the thoughts I have about the Gavrin track really still apply here. Something about this track immediately hits me as a little dull and meandering, like it doesn't really have a good sense of direction. But as I listened to it more and thought about the context of the story that this area represents, the thought of that suspenseful fear, a lurking enemy, Combined with how the musical language of Dread has already formed a backdrop over the course of the previous gameplay, this track actually fits very well, in my opinion. Even though I don't find it interesting or pleasant on its face, it's really not meant to be listened to like that. It's one part of the whole that is the Dread soundtrack, and I actually think going through this area as Samus and uncovering the X as these strange 9 beats of piano cluster chords repeat over and over again, you really do feel uneasy. I think this comment I saw when I was watching the video of the original sums it up pretty well. So while there is a part of me that wanted to try and recreate this track and some of its elements in a way that felt more in line with my musical style, I had to stop and ask myself, what is the language that my reimagined soundtrack demonstrates? What types of elements have I presented and taught the listener over the last 7 areas? And when I began to answer that question, I really came to the conclusion that my version of Elun, the same sense of fear and tension, had to come from a very different musical place. And so once again, I felt that I needed to start from scratch. There were moments where I was tempted to find a spot for that piano motif or the sustained voices over top, but ultimately I realized that to reimagine a soundtrack, it doesn't just mean remixing or recreating something with the same elements that somebody else used, but truly reimagining what the game calls for and using your own voice as a musician and composer to fill that need. So again, I would preface this version of Elun by saying, if you really appreciate and have deeply associated this area with the original track, which to some extent we all have, this may feel a bit like a deviation, and maybe too extreme of one to your taste. But the goal for me was to bring you, the listener and player, to the same place emotionally, while taking a very different route to get there. As always, please let me know your thoughts on the score in the comments. I always love interacting with you all down there. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And please enjoy this 8th part of the Metroid Dread Reimagined soundtrack.